When Rocky Morton got the call that he'd be directing Super Mario Brothers, he turned to his wife, who was also his co-director, and said, "This is it. This is going to be our Batman." 30 years later, he still can't get work in Hollywood. In the early 90s, Mario was more popular than Mickey Mouse. The third game alone had earned over $500 million. There were Mario pajamas, Mario cereal, Mario everything. So when Hollywood finally got the film rights, this should have been the easiest slam dunk in history. 3 years later, the movie made $21 million on a $48 million budget. The lead actor called the directors f***ing idiots, and Nintendo was so traumatized by the whole experience that they kept Mario off the big screen for the next 30 years. What happened in between is one of the craziest stories in film history, and it starts weirdly enough with a cup of tea. In 1990, Roland Joffe flew to Japan with this crazy idea that he could talk Nintendo into selling him the Mario rights. Every major studio in Hollywood was trying to get the same thing. Joffe showed up with almost no money, but he got a meeting with Nintendo's president, Hiroshi Yamauchi, and somehow he talked his way into a deal. $2 million for the film rights. Joffe later said he thinks Hiroshi just kind of liked him, mentioned the tea was really good. Whatever happened in that room, Joffe walked out with the rights to the most valuable franchise of the decade. Hollywood couldn't believe it. This little production company had just snatched Mario away from the big studios. What nobody realized was that the studios had actually dodged a bullet. See, Nintendo wasn't interested in being a creative partner. Their president treated the whole movie like a science experiment, some sort of strange creature he was curious to watch. So Nintendo just took the check and disappeared. No notes, no oversight, no creative input. They figured Mario was bulletproof. Whatever Hollywood did, the brand would survive. So now Joffe has the rights, but he needs a movie. And this is where things start going sideways. The first writer he brought in was Barry Morrow, who'd won an Oscar for Rain Man. And Morrow wrote something pretty serious, more of a character drama than a fun adventure. The producers didn't want that. They wanted a movie that could compete with E.T. and Batman and Ghostbusters all at once. So they brought in another writer, then another. Meanwhile, they're trying to attach a director. Danny DeVito got offered the job in the lead role. He passed. They went after Schwarzenegger to play the villain, then Michael Keaton. Directors kept getting hired and fired. 2 years of this. Eventually, the job landed with Rocky Morton and Annabelle Jankel, a couple who'd spent their careers doing commercials and music videos. They'd tried to make a feature once before and it flopped, but they had a vision for Mario and they were hungry. When Morton got the call, he turned to his wife and said, "This is it. This is going to be our Batman." But it wasn't going to be their Batman. When Morton and Jankel finally got on set in 1992, they walked into something they were completely unprepared for. The production designer was David Snyder, who'd worked on Blade Runner, and the sets he built looked like Blade Runner. They constructed this massive, elaborate dystopian city called Dino Hatton. There were gangsters and strippers. Costume department put the actors in leather and fishnets. It looked incredible, actually, kind of like a cyberpunk nightmare. It just looked nothing like Mario. And that became a problem. When studio executives flew down to see what their money was paying for, they freaked out. This wasn't the cute family adventure they could slap on a lunchbox, but by this point, the sets were already built, millions already spent. Starting over wasn't an option. So instead of one clear vision, you had Morton and Jankel trying to make their dark, edgy movie while the studio pushed for something safe and family-friendly, and the movie just got torn apart between those two directions. Just 2 weeks before cameras started rolling, the studio handed Morton and Jankel a completely new script. Nobody had told them it was coming. They'd already storyboarded the entire movie based on the old version. Now they were supposed to throw all that work away and make something completely different. And they weren't allowed to talk to the writer. Of course, the actors all signed up on our original script, and when the new script came in, Annabelle and I had to justify the new script. We had to pretend that it was great and convince the actors to go along with it. You can imagine how well that went. And the rewrites didn't stop there. Over the next few months, 7 different writers took passes at this thing. The archive eventually had over 1,000 pages in it, 25 different versions of the script. Scenes were cut or extended without explanation. I don't know what draft I got, but by the time we started shooting, it had completely changed. And not only that, but they had the writers there constantly rewriting it. Their basic approach seemed to be, how dumb can we make this? It didn't make sense to me or any of the other actors. It had no spirit or energy. It was hard to get behind it. That's Richard Edson, one of the actors. The movie ruined his career and he never recovered. Dennis Hopper was playing the villain, and at some point he just gave up trying to follow the story. The script had probably been rewritten 5 or 6 times by the time I arrived. I don't really bother with it anymore. I just go in and do it scene by scene. There was no point reading ahead because it would all be different tomorrow anyway. On set, nobody knew what movie they were making. The crew didn't know what they were building. The actors didn't know what they were playing. Morton and Jankel were drowning. They'd never handled anything this big. Commercials are 30 seconds. You control every frame. And now they had hundreds of crew members, a budget in the tens of millions, and a production that was changing underneath them every single day. Every single night, the producers would drag them into a trailer and tell them they were about to be fired, that they were doing a terrible job, that they were spending too much money, that the whole production was a disaster. They got so desperate for control that they started micromanaging everything, even the cinematographer. And that was Dean Simler, who had won an Oscar for Dances with Wolves, and the crew started calling the directors the Hydra because there were too many heads giving orders. Then the Los Angeles Times sent a reporter to do a set visit, and what he found was a disaster. Cast and crew were openly trashing the production. Hopper gave a quote, said that the director's refusal to do interviews was the only intelligent thing I've heard that they've really actually done. That article ran on the front page of the calendar section. And the day after it came out, CAA, one of the biggest talent agencies in Hollywood, dropped Morton and Jankel. The movie wasn't even finished. They still had weeks of shooting left, including the entire ending. But their careers in Hollywood were already over. The producers eventually just told them to leave. We're going to make the rest of the movie without you. Someone else shot the ending. Morton and Jankel packed up and went home, and when they got back to LA, their phones went dead. Morton said later it was the end of our movie careers. We couldn't get an agent. No scripts would come. We couldn't get meetings. The phones literally stopped ringing. It was like being a leper. For years afterward, whenever he tried to pitch anything, people would hear Super Mario Brothers, and the conversation would just end. They never directed another feature film. Morton went back to commercials. Built a successful company, actually. Won awards. But the stain never washed off. He was still the guy who ruined Super Mario Brothers. The movie premiered on May 28, 1993. It opened to $8.5 million. 4th place at the box office, behind Sylvester Stallone and Cliffhanger. 2 weeks later, Jurassic Park arrived and buried everything. Final box office was just $21 million against a $48 million budget, and that's before marketing costs. But the numbers weren't even the worst part. The worst part was Bob Hoskins. For years after the movie came out, Hoskins just kept trashing it in interviews. He called Super Mario Brothers the worst thing he ever did. He called the directors fucking idiots whose arrogance had been mistaken for talent. He said their own agent told them to get off the set. When your lead actor says that publicly, there's no coming back. That quote followed Morton and Jankel around for decades. And Nintendo learned exactly the wrong lesson. Or maybe the right one, depending on how you look at it. When people asked Miyamoto years later why the company had been so protective of Mario, he said they were fearful of all the failure of past adaptations. The fans get outraged and mad because the studios didn't do justice to the original work. We really didn't want a backlash. One bad movie in 1993 convinced Nintendo to never let go of the steering wheel again. For 30 years, they kept Mario off the big screen entirely. There's a sort of a happy ending to all this, though. In March 2023, Quentin Tarantino's theater, the New Beverly Cinema, hosted a midnight screening of the original Super Mario Bros. Morton and Jankel showed up. It was the first time they'd watched their own movie in 30 years. They figured maybe 10 or 20 people would be there. Instead, the place was packed. There was a line around the block for extra tickets. Jankel said it felt like being at a film festival. 30 years of being Hollywood's favorite punching bag, and one night at the New Beverly changed how she felt about the whole thing. 1 month later, the new animated Mario movie came out. Nintendo had controlled every single part of it. It made $1.36 billion. And Jaffe, the producer who started the whole thing, never heard what Nintendo thought about the finished movie. After all that mess, they never even called to complain.